we do have a big problem that there are 40,000 cannabis prisoners still, languishing in prisons all across America for often things as simple as possession. And that is just wrong. There's no way that I can be a champion of the legal marketplace that's emerging now and ignore that fact.
Welcome to And Then Everything Changed, a podcast about the pivotal moments in life and decisions that define us. I'm your host, Ronit Plank. Today, I'm speaking with Danielle Simone Brand, who's a freelance writer and the author of Weed Mom, the Canna-Curious Woman's Guide to Healthier Relaxation, Happier Parenting, and Chilling TF Out. Well, I think it's for the bleep out, and that's through Ulysses Press. And Weed Mom is the first and only book made just for busy moms and packed with tons and tons of different advice and background and history. So welcome, Danielle.
Thank you, Ronit. I'm thrilled to be here with you.
I'm so happy you're here, and it's funny to me because I've been connected to you for a while on social media, but I just realized recently, oh my gosh, I have to have you on the podcast, and you apparently had the same thought at the same time.
I did. It was such serendipity. I thought about your podcast one morning. I was like, oh, that'd be cool to be interviewed by Ronit. And then you asked me that same day. So
it was so
wild.
Weird. Like, I don't know what happened. I mean, I love stuff like that. So I knew about your work. For anyone listening, I knew about Danielle's work, and I knew what her platform was, and, Weed Mom was the book, but I hadn't really explored it myself, on a personal level. And I just love the style that you take in this book. I mean, there's so much I want to say, and we'll get to a lot of it, I hope. But in general, like from the opening page, your book is so approachable and so warm. And I feel like your writing style is not just accessible, but really, I feel like you look at your own behavior and your own patterns, and you are inviting the reader to kind of come along the journey with you.
Thank you. I did try to do that. I wanted this book to be, like I was taking someone's hand, a good friend's hand, and showing them this new world of legal cannabis. And I wanted it to be approachable and entertaining. And, I definitely had to reveal some of my flaws for that to happen.
Yes. And we're going to talk about that too, because I mean, I want to really emphasize that there is so much in this book, and it's amazing. So if what we talk about sounds good to you, then you should definitely go get the book, and we'll circle back about how to do that afterward. But the first way, the way you begin your book is that you talk about alcohol. It's almost like a love letter or a breakup letter, actually, to alcohol. You're addressing the preface of the book to alcohol, saying that you have to move on and you're done with alcohol. And I'm curious what made you, I loved it, because I think there's a lot of conversation, at least in my circles these days, about how alcohol is affecting us, and some people are giving it up or reducing because COVID sort of increased the alcohol consumption for a lot of people I know, including myself. So you wrote this book and had it published before COVID was playing a really big part, I think, in our alcohol consumption. But can you talk a little bit about why you decided to begin the book as a breakup to, a breakup with alcohol?
Sure. Yeah. So that particular piece, it's the preface of the book now. It was published in Civilized.life, January 2019. So right at New Year's in 2019. And that's a cannabis publication. And it was me sort of officially coming out of that green closet, as we sometimes say, and saying, like, look, I really enjoy this plant, and it helps support me in so many ways that, go way beyond what alcohol ever did for me, and I enjoyed alcohol for a large part of my life. I certainly, it was my go-to for socializing and relaxing. And, but I always felt like there were some negatives to alcohol with the way that I felt, often during imbibing or the next day, even if I were drinking moderately, which I always did. I never had, any sort of excess problem with alcohol, but it just didn't make me feel good afterward, even though I would enjoy that giddy, sociable thing, while consuming. And so, when I discovered legal cannabis, it wasn't until I was in my late 30s, and I clicked with it. It just really resonated with my body, with my mind, with my spirit, with my energy. And I realized, yeah, I actually don't need alcohol at all anymore.
Right. And it is a funny thing to think about doing something. I mean, if you think about it objectively without a real long history of imbibing or doing drugs or anything like that, what would we willingly choose to do that made us feel really good? And then the next day or the time following it made us feel really bad that we would continue to do, right? Like, it doesn't make any sense if you think about it. Right. So
I know.
Yeah. So go back for me, just before we start the journey deeper into your process, what were your earliest impressions or relationships with cannabis, even before you met your husband?
So I grew up in Hawaii, which, as you probably know, has a strong cannabis culture. And so I would say that I grew up kind of on the periphery of that. And I knew a lot of people, even in high school, who consumed cannabis. And I guess it was kind of a joke, like, oh, yeah, that person's a stoner, whatever,
Yeah.
Which now I understand there's so many ways to use the plant, and I don't need to rely on those stereotypes anymore. But, absolutely, I think for a while I just thought of it as someone else's other people's thing. It just wasn't my thing. I didn't understand it because, I talk about this in the book. The legal marketplace really gave me tools to understand what I was putting into my body or inhaling or whatever, whatever mode I was using to consume. And that's something I just never had with the legacy market. That's often the term that we use to, refer to the illegal market. The legacy market just didn't offer any of that, information about the percentage of THC, the other cannabinoids that might be in there besides THC, the terpenes, which also affect your experience pretty profoundly. These are parts that we're only discovering now with cannabis science progressing. And so I guess I would say that my relationship before was I just didn't understand it and I didn't get it.
Yeah. And you speak candidly in your book about, and early on too, about marital troubles you had, an affair you had, mental health, for you and for your husband. Why was that important for you to include?
Yeah, it wasn't easy to write about that stuff, for sure. My husband and I went through a really rough period in our marriage. This was about 5 years ago by now, and came very close to getting a divorce. I won't lie, and he actually filed for divorce on our 13th wedding anniversary. Fun story. And it was a really difficult, really confusing time for me, but also out of that moment came a lot of good and a lot of change, and it's part of my life story. And this book, even though it's a guide for other moms who are curious about cannabis, who don't know about the legal marketplace yet, at the same time, I really wanted to be relatable, and I wanted to show, to illustrate my journey with cannabis and to show that really I have not been a long time enthusiast. This is something that came to me later in life and an appreciation that grew over time. And so I think that like adds some relatability for moms who are maybe not sure at this point about cannabis, but think it may be something that could, help them. So yeah, words and all, I definitely went into some of that, including my husband's cannabis dependence for a long time, and how I looked down on cannabis really because of how I saw him self-medicating in a way that wasn't very effective.
Yes, and it's interesting because when I was talking to a friend about the backstory here about your husband getting really dependent on it, of course, I mean, I can imagine, you might imagine what they said to me. They said, but you can't get addicted or dependent on marijuana. And I said, well, I don't think that's the case. And so what is the story with that?
That's something that in the cannabis community itself is still being discussed and figured out. Honestly, if you ask addiction specialists, they will also have lots and lots of different opinions on it. So, where what I've come to understand from the science that's available and from a lot of anecdotal evidence, from people who have been consuming cannabis for years, is that, there is a component of physiological and mental dependence for cannabis that isn't anything like alcohol or opioids or opiates or heroin or any of these very addictive nicotine, even any of these very addictive substances that we know. It's not like that, but there is some degree of dependence. If people are consuming cannabis very, very regularly in order to feel a certain way or in order to change how they feel for the better, that can be a little bit of a slippery slope. And I do talk about, intentionally consuming cannabis to change the way I feel, but it's all about being mindful of how much I'm consuming, when I'm consuming, what my, intentions are behind it. And I think that if we can be really, really aware of that, then the risk for dependence is pretty low for most people. But, you can become dependent on cannabis just like you can become dependent on, so many different things that we use in our everyday lives. And, for my husband, he went to rehab, I say in the book, and it's not like he was detoxing or anything like that. You don't detox from cannabis. You might, feel a little off for, a week or two if you are a regular user and then you stop. But he had to basically recalibrate his relationship to it. He had to find some other tools for coping, some healthy self-care tools to go along with cannabis eventually. And then actually he's been through an interesting dance with it. Now he abstains altogether. But I feel like there's a spectrum of the ways that people consume cannabis and a spectrum of ways that we can have a relationship with it. And I'm all about conscious, intentional use, but, it's also possible to, to overuse it. I don't want to shy away from that.
And, I have to ask if it's at all any issue between the two of you, because there are partnerships where one drinks alcohol, one doesn't, and, one might enjoy cannabis and one doesn't. But in your case, is it ever difficult for him? I mean, how did the two of you reach this point where you are such an advocate and you are such a proponent of weed, and yet he absolutely has learned, as I've just heard from you, that he needs to not have any? It's just one of the greatest ironies of our lives. We've been through such a dance with it, When we first met, he was the consumer and I was the abstainer, and at various points we've both been consumers, and now I consume and he abstains. It's just, you got to communicate. I think that's the main thing. We keep talking about it. Yeah.
And it's been an ongoing conversation, and I check in with him regularly, and I'm also discreet about my consumption, but that's also because we live at home with our two kids, and I'm not smoking on the couch or anything like that. I'm discreet about the way I consume, and I think that helps. But, of course, conflicts have come up, and then we have to readjust. But right now, I think we're in a good place.
Yeah, and I loved what you wrote in the book. This also is fairly early on. I'm going to just quote you here. But as with so many things in life, the line between abhorrence and acceptance is much finer than we all might like to think. We humans are sure that we're sure about so many things until we're not. For me, cannabis was one of those things. And that's the end of your quote. And I feel so strongly about this because sometimes a really strong reaction in someone to something, if you have a really strong negative reaction, indicates a lot of energy there. And that's also what's really funny and also very honest about the way you approach your book, because you have this backstory, as I mentioned before, of a partner with some issues with cannabis, with your own dislike of cannabis, and here you are now, this cheerleader for cannabis.
I know, it's just a funny thing. Like I have to be humble about my choices at this point, because
right, because you never know.
Because we change, yes. and I accept that as part of being human. Like living things grow, right?
Yes, that's perfect. So let's dive in here. What do people usually get wrong about weed? Let's just go with it. Like, what are the tropes and what are the stereotypes that so often people believe about weed and weed use?
Yeah, great question. I think that the biggest one is just the lazy stoner, that there are many people who think that, okay, sure, it's fine for relaxing once in a while, but if it's a regular part of your life, you're gonna drop out of your work and not show up for your kids and all that sort of thing. And that couldn't be further from the truth. Honestly, it's been really interesting to me since I started the journey of writing this book, and since it's been out and received out there in the world by the canna-mom community, as we put it. So many moms have come out and said, cannabis helps me be productive. Cannabis helps me meet all of my responsibilities. It helps me, show up better for my job and my kids and my partner and myself. That's huge. We show up for everybody else in our lives, moms, and sometimes it can be really hard to show up for ourselves. So, I truly, truly find that as well, that I'm a more productive and happier person with cannabis in my life. So that lazy stoner stereotype is one thing. And I think I would dispel that, that myth a little bit by talking about just the variety, the spectrum of ways we can use cannabis and ways, and different kinds of cannabis products. There are some that will make us super relaxed and want to, watch Netflix and fall asleep, which is great sometimes. And then there are other formulations, other strains, other, combinations of different cannabinoids and terpenes that can really give us a boost to productivity and energy, and then everything in between. So that's a big one. That's a big stoner, stereotype, is that it makes you lazy.
Right, or that you're kind of dropping out of something. I think that's that bigger picture of you're dropping out and tuning out with marijuana, whereas in your book, and there's so much to learn there. I'm still trying to absorb all of it, but even the CBD THC thing, which is something I didn't even understand, which I'll have you cover in a second, but this idea that you can kind of use different elements of the plant to bring out what you want to bring out in yourself.
Yeah, and it's fascinating. And that's one reason I truly fell in love with cannabis from an intellectual standpoint, I would say, even before I fell in love with it from a personal consumption standpoint. Like, I was writing as a freelancer a bit about cannabis before really experimenting much myself with the legal marketplace. And I realized that, there are just so many possibilities. Cannabis science is in its infancy, and yet we know so much already about how different products and modalities, ways of consuming, affect people differently. So yeah, that's a fascinating aspect of this plant, and one reason I love it.
Yeah, and when do you think the canna-mom community really came out? I'm sure there were always canna-moms. I remember when I first moved to Seattle, a friend of a friend talked about making, pot cookies, and she had a little kid. And I remember, this is me back in 2006, I think, being kind of appalled. How could you do that around your kid? And how could you have it in the house? Truly. And now, cut to, I'm walking around with your book and my daughter, who's 16. This is so funny. My daughter went to the orthodontist today, and I had the book, and she came out from her appointment. She said, "Mom, you can't just have that book with you." That's so funny.
I love it. Oh, I love that my book is provoking discussion.
From a teenager, even, like the teenagers are the ones who are supposed to be more relaxed about that.
Right. They're subject to conditioning too around the plant, and the stereotypes are still out there. The negative assumptions are still out there, but that's what I'm hoping to do with my book is just to counter some of those, or to provide another perspective, to provide this, what I see as healthy, conscious, uplifted, a choice to consume something. So that's the way I see it.
The Canna-mom community, when did it become, from what you understand, when did it become sort of a place to be?
Right. I think it's new. It's really new, at least on social media in this more public way. And in the last year or so, I've been amazed at the number of canna-moms I have found on Instagram in particular, and the numbers that are emerging daily. And I get DMs almost daily from people saying, "I'm coming out of the green closet now." And I'm going to make my first post about how I'm a mom who enjoys cannabis. And I just love that. I think that right now is the moment, the stigmas are falling away. They're still there, but they are starting to dissolve. And of course, our legal situation is progressing very rapidly across the U.S.
Yeah. How many states currently have legalized it?
So there are 36 medical states, and within those 36, 18 of them now have adult use legalized. Now, not all of them have an actual adult use market set up yet, but they have legalized and are either in the adult use market or in the process of creating one.
Do you think that that this was going to be the outcome? Do you feel like people were pretty optimistic years ago that this was the direction our country was moving in, or did it seem insurmountable to get weed more mainstreamed?
You know, that's a great question. I think that, you know, in the 70s, if you look at opinion polls, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they are very low in favor of legalization, even though a lot of people actually smoked pot in the 70s. Right?
Yeah.
And steadily since then, it's just like, it's just been a steady increase of numbers of people who are in favor of legalization. Slow but steady for a long time, but in the past couple of years, I'd say like 3 to 4 years, those numbers have just grown and grown and grown. And now, I mean, the latest poll that I have seen, somewhere in the 90% range of Americans think that medical should be legal, medical marijuana should be legal, and somewhere in the range of 61% of Americans surveyed said that they think all uses should be legal for adults.
Yeah, that's a lot of progress.
It is.
Do you feel, were you ready when you wrote the book to become the voice of this? I mean, did you kind of ease into this idea that this was now going to become sort of a platform for you and you were going to become expert, or did that part take you by surprise?
You know, it's been interesting. I wrote about cannabis before writing the book, and I wrote about parenting before writing the book, but bringing them together in a book itself has been really interesting. And I don't think that I was very public before as a freelancer, even though I was writing about cannabis. So clearly someone who had interest could figure out that I was probably an enthusiast or consumer myself, but I wasn't very public about it. And since the book has come out, it's been really interesting. It's been a ride. However, I don't see myself as the voice for Canna-Moms. I see myself as one of many voices. I have the only book out there right now, that's true. But there are organizations and courses and tons of social media influencers that are all sort of geared towards this Canna-Mom space right now. So I see myself as part of this group of of moms on the front lines saying, hey, it's okay. Like, we don't have to have these stigmas, all this shame about it. We can be good moms, good partners, and cannabis lovers at the same time.
Yes, and actually I pulled some quotes from from some of the moms that you quoted, and I just want to read these aloud so people can get a sense of what the feedback is. So here's a quote from Jessie Gill, who is a cannabis nurse and founder of marijuanamommy.com, and she has a lengthier quote, but I'm just going to pull out this part. Quote, I strongly believe it makes me a better mom. Cannabis slows down my thoughts. It helps me be more present. I'm not thinking of the million things I have to do. And then there is there's a nice quote by Jenny, mom of one in New Hampshire. She says it's menopause made orgasms meh, and cannabis brings them back with a vengeance. And then the last one I want to share, because I do want to lead into this, for race privilege and weed momming. Kania from Michigan said this, quote, just because some of us use cannabis, it doesn't make us bad mothers. I believe cannabis makes me a more patient and understanding mother. So those are some of the really important takeaways from your book, which is that you can be a good mom and you can take care of yourself with cannabis. And there are so many varieties of getting it and types, and you have such a extensive guide in there about which kinds to use for what your purposes are, and that is like really helpful.
Good. I'm so glad, because honestly, I didn't know where to start when I began experimenting with the legal marketplace myself. And I went to a dispensary and felt totally overwhelmed by the choices.
Oh my gosh, I can imagine.
Right? You know, if you've been inside a dispensary these days, you know that choices abound. So yeah, I wrote it for many, many different reasons. I would say, getting people acquainted with the legal marketplace is absolutely a big part of it. And then the cultural conversation is another piece. And I know you want to talk about that too.
Yes. And you do cover so much. And I just want to, some of the smattering of that is the history of marijuana, how to know if you have a problem, legalizing pot, and this really important one, which is the race privilege and weed momming. So did you realize that you were going to have to devote some time to the effect of the criminality of marijuana in non-white populations, like in Black and brown populations?
Yes, I think because of being a cannabis freelancer for a few years and being in generally progressive spaces online, I would say, I was very aware of that issue and the fact that there would be some skepticism or criticism even potentially of me as a white woman writing this book. As the first woman to write a book about, cannabis and moms and almost some people would say glorifying it or saying, yay, this is a net good. Okay, yes, it is a net good, I believe, but we do have a big problem that there are 40,000 cannabis prisoners still, languishing in prisons all across America for often things as simple as possession. And that is just wrong. There's no way that I can be a champion of the legal marketplace that's emerging now and ignore that fact.
And I hadn't thought much about this until I was explaining it to a friend. I had thought about the idea that, it's sort of this, maybe it's a circular type of argument, but it's very useful to look at. You could say, oh, here's this blonde white woman writing about this, obviously she gets the best end of the deal. And, what about all these people who are incarcerated and people who've been punished and get punished now for possession who don't have this privilege, right? But you could also see that you're writing the book and helping to normalize pot will have sort of a, not just you, but everyone. I'm not trying to say that you're the only one. I understand that you're really respectful about that. But the trickle down effect so that we all understand that it can be used in life without criminality, and that will hopefully move the needle further to making it legal in more states, which will hopefully help with the incarceration issue, which will hopefully filter down and remove this race privilege a little bit.
And that's my hope. I certainly hope that the increased normalization of cannabis, responsible cannabis consumption by everyone, including white moms, is going to help push that needle. Because, if white moms are doing it, the so conventional wisdom might go, right? It doesn't have to be something you're so afraid of.
Right.
And it's not something we need to lock people up for.
Right. And so if white moms are doing it, like it's got to be the most normal thing, right? Because, if they're doing rosé all day, then, why not some cannabis, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So when you think about, I know that a lot of people in the surveys that you cite in your book, one of them showed, I think 40% of people who are using cannabis are doing so for pain. And I think, if I recall, yes, then we've got anxiety as a 20% use. And then for sleep insomnia, it's about 11%. But what I didn't realize was that you can actually make sex and orgasms that much better or more frequent by using cannabis. So can you talk a little bit about what you've learned?
Yeah, I can. And I also wanted to address something that you mentioned just now in this question, which is sort of the ways that people are consuming cannabis, or the reasons people are consuming cannabis, I should say. And my book does not cover medical uses in depth. It touches on them, but it's not just fun, recreation, adult use that I'm talking about either. I'm talking about kind of this middle space between medical and pure fun. I'm talking about this wellness space in the middle that can be enjoyable and can be pure fun, but it also can be, helping to treat a condition like addressing pain, as you were just saying, or dealing with anxiety. So I think that these two buckets of medical and recreational cannabis they make sense from a regulatory framework, but they don't really make sense from the perspective of the ways people are actually consuming. So I did want to get that across in my book, that I am using cannabis and so many moms are using it for these wellness reasons. I sleep better. I have less anxiety. I also have better sex. Is that just fun, or is that also wellness? I think it's everything.
Right. And especially as people get older and there's, this idea of women maturing and going through menopause or perimenopause and feeling like their bodies are not understandable anymore. And so seeing that quote that I referenced earlier about the woman in menopause finding her sense of sexuality to be enhanced and better because of her cannabis use was really heartening.
I do, yeah. I find that as well, even though I'm not in the menopausal stage yet, but, on the horizon, if we're lucky, right?
Yeah.
It's going to come one day. And, I think that cannabis can be particularly helpful around these transition points, these big transition points in a mother's life. And one of the first one is obviously becoming a parent and going through those early years of really intense parenting when your child or children are small and just need your help so much of the time, and our physical bodies are so wrapped up in that. For me, at least, sex did not feel very appealing at that time. So that's one particular way that cannabis can help us get out of our minds, ease our to-do list, let go of the to-do list for a little bit. Cannabis enhances sensation, physical sensation, and the five senses, which, as we know, plays a huge role in our, arousal and communication with a partner. So there, definitely in that earlier transition, and then later on in adulthood, in the menopausal transition, I think that cannabis can, again, be very, very helpful for, once again, tuning into one's own body, which just sounds so simple, and it's so hard for most of us to actually do. Right?
Yes, for sure. And I did see that quoted a bunch. And I relate to this too, that idea of being present with your children and not being able to maybe shut off the chatter or the list going in your head or the worries. I mean, so many of us have that. And I think that as mothers, that's pretty common. And to be able to think about honing in on the activity you're doing with your kid, or being at peace with yourself for not being with your kid at that moment and maybe doing something else, right? That's really powerful, and that does kind of increase your quality of life.
It really does. And it's all about creating an intentional life. And I think that there are many ways to do that. You don't have to consume cannabis to create an intentional life.
Right.
But it's one tool for me. In this plethora of tools that I have yoga, I have meditation, I have therapy, I have, walks in nature, all these, really supportive things for me, and everyone, I encourage to find their own, whatever works for you. But for me, cannabis is one of those things that helps me tune in, helps me be more present, helps me actually pay attention to what my body is asking for, needs and wants. And then, when I'm more content physiologically and mentally, I'm much more available for my kids too.
In our final moments here, what would you love to see in the next 5 years? The effect of canna-momming in the culture.
Yeah, well, what I want to see in the next 5 years, and gosh, am I hoping this is true, is federal decriminalization at the very least. Because, like we were saying earlier, no one should be in jail for cannabis. We do not need to be locking people up for possessing a plant. So, federal decriminalization.
When you say it that way, Danielle, nothing seems more clear.
Yes. Exactly. So that is first and foremost, because I care about wellness and I care about, moms having a, better time parenting and all that stuff. I care about it a lot, but fundamentally, none of this is actually okay if there are still people being arrested or still, people serving time. So that's huge. And I don't even care if most states don't want to set up an adult use marketplace. Just stop arresting people, stop putting people in jail. So
Exactly.
Yeah. So that's huge. And then beyond that, if we see some kind of, actual interstate commerce open up, or federal full-on legalization, that would be fantastic. But that to me is icing.
Yeah.
And then besides that, I would like to see cannabis, I would like to see the stereotypes continue to diminish as they are. I would like to see people understand cannabis as a viable alternative to alcohol on the sort of simplest level, but also as something that can actually help them live a better life, live a fuller life. If they take the time to learn about it, to educate themselves, and to, read some books, maybe mine, maybe a bunch of other great ones out there. There are so many great books on cannabis. And just to welcome it as part of our lives. We can normalize cannabis in a responsible way, and it doesn't have to be a big scary thing. So that's my hope.
Yeah. And what's next for you? What are you working on now?
Yeah, well, right now I'm doing some freelancing. I'm doing some freelance copywriting as well, continuing to talk about my book too, and I'm invited on podcasts and fun things like that. And book-wise, I have some ideas, but I don't have a proposal in the making yet. Potentially a Weed Mom 2.0 down the road.
I was just going to ask. I didn't want to put you on the spot, but I was going to ask you, do you feel like there's another volume out there?
I think that there is because, only because this landscape is changing so quickly. It's cannabis, they say that 1 year in cannabis is like 7 years in the rest of the world, in the sense of just how quickly things change and how much we're learning, how much the science is progressing. So yeah, I do feel like updates could be possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And so for people who want to find you, shout out, your social media handle and what kinds of things you do there and where people can find you in general.
Yeah, I'm on Instagram at Danielle Simone Brand and love hanging out with Ronit there.
I love seeing your stuff there, yeah.
And on Instagram, I'm the most active around my book, and it's a combination of education about responsible use and really just sharing little tidbits from my experience as a yoga teacher for a long time and my life as a parent. I'm just trying to help promote education and to normalize responsible use and just to show people that it can be done.
Yes, and your book is so inviting and informative. It just kind of really, it soars, I feel, like with the information and your approach and the way you've organized it. It's just like a home run.
Oh, thank you so much. That means a lot to me. It's definitely my book baby, and I put a lot into it, so I appreciate that.
Yeah, and it's really beautiful. It's really well done. Well, thank you so much for taking the time to come on. I know there's so much other stuff to look at in the book, and I hope that people who are interested in the subject and found this conversation to be intriguing will go pick up a copy because there's a lot to learn. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Ronit. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Thank you for listening to And Then Everything Changed. For more on this episode, photos, and other episodes you might like, please visit atecpodcast.com. You can connect with me and learn more about episodes on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram also. Just search for my name, Ronit Plank, RONITPLANK, and you will find all the updates. If you like this podcast, please remember to subscribe and also rate and review so other people can find it. Thank you so much for listening.